Well, welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to have you here today, and we're delighted to have Sir Muir Gray back talking to us again. Some of you may have heard his inspirational talk in December 2022 when he talked about learning is the elixir of healthy life. And I hope that those of you who did hear that talk have been brushing your teeth on one foot ever since, because that was one of his tips to help us keep fit and healthy. But today he's going to talk to us about how to reduce our risk of developing dementia, something that I think we're all very, very keen to do all we can. Sir Muir Gray is CBE, and he's been a public health doctor through his life. He's been involved in so many numerous things. I'll just mention a couple. National Library for Health, currently working on better value healthcare, aiming to reduce the 50% of money that potentially wasted in the NHS at the moment. And live longer better, which is utterly at the heart of what the Future Lives Group is all about, informing and inspiring you all to live your best possible future lives. Just before I hand over to Sir Muir, for those of you who might leave before we finish, just a brief mention, our next talk on the 16th of April, Tuesday the 16th of April, is George Lee, Living with Purpose, the Key to Longevity, Happiness and Global Change. And then on the 14th of May, Tuesday the 14th of May at 2 o'clock, we're having another open space event. This is an event which is your opportunity to really engage with us. We very much value the information you give us, particularly when you fill in the feedback form about future topics that you want to hear about, views that you've got. So I very much hope that you'll want to join us on the 14th of May for the open space event. And with that, let me hand over to Sir Muir Gray. Thank you.
There's always been a disease that people fear most. It was the plague, Black Death. And then when that came under control, it became cholera. And the fear of cholera dominated society, understandably, because the mortality rates were so high. Then, thanks to good old-fashioned public health, the London water supply and the water supply in every population. Loch Katrine was the water supply for Glasgow. The water was collected. We left it in the reservoirs to let the rubbish sink to the foot, piped it, filtered it, and then sent out. So cholera came under control. Then came tuberculosis, the wasting disease. And really for the first half of the century, TB was the most feared disease. And there's wonderful books on tuberculosis, of course, like The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which give you a feeling of the way it dominated society. Then, when TB came under control, vaccination and immunization, along came cancer. And cancer has really dominated our lives for the last 50 years. But actually, it's cancer, I say to people who've got cancer, it's a long-term condition. It's changed dramatically. And the treatment is not nearly so bad as chemotherapy used to be. So cancer is no longer the most feared disease. I find the most feared disease is stroke and dementia. And the two are linked together in a way I'll explain. So the good news is that your risk of stroke and dementia can be significantly reduced, not just by the health service, but by things you can do yourself. So I'm going to give you a presentation, and as with my previous talk, Janet, I'd really like some of you to give it to your, suppose I sent you a copy of the PowerPoint. I would like to feel that you could give it to your u3a. So I think, Janet, I'm looking for even 1 or 2 volunteers who could give, it's just like drug reps. I remember seeing many years ago how the drug companies were very good. They could train intelligent people, young graduates usually, to go and meet a room full of doctors and give a talk confidently. And that's what I'd like to do, Janet, with Healthy Life members, to go out. I'd like you also go to every bridge club, every bowls club, every mosque and every church to do it. But you must watch, and I can spot an exploitee at 100 meters, even digitally. So I'm creating work for you. But let's think about that too, Janet, when we think about spreading the message. because learning is the elixir of life, and u3a is an organization committed to learning. So let me see if I can share my screen, Harriet.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Muir.
That okay? Good. Okay. So I'm going to speak to you about our dementia risk reduction program. And this is part of what we call Live Longer Better. And this is the objectives. And this is the century of the system and the network. System's a set of activities with a common set of objectives. I've had 20 reorganizations of the NHS, most of which have made no difference at all. But we're now seeing that bureaucracies and markets, although important, cannot solve complex problems like population aging. You need systems and networks. So here's what we've been working on, is that everyone, every health service, local authorities, HUK, u3a, should say that this is what we're trying to achieve. And as you can see, they range from pretty obvious things like supporting carers better, to preventing and minimizing the risk, the effects of poverty. And that one at the foot of the list is interesting. And I don't know if you had a discussion on this, Janet, but I think this is a hot topic that needs more discussion. It's getting a bit of air at the moment, of course, in terms of the legal side. But even without the legal side, people need to think a little bit more about the last year of life and make their views clear. But today, I'm going to focus on the objective set out in bold there, to reduce the risk of and delay or prevent dementia. Most of what I say will also help reverse the effects of dementia, but we may take that up in the discussion too. So I want to emphasize that you may have seen things on dementia in your local newspaper, and you may have seen things on frailty, but actually they're very similar, and it's part of the sort of medical imperialism that the psychiatrists focus on dementia and the geriatricians focus on frailty, but actually the risk factors are the same. And these are conditions which, as I'll describe, we can reduce the risk, prevent, and delay. I don't very much like the word frailty. I don't like the word multimorbidity. I've got multimorbidity myself, actually. I've got numerous conditions. I've got heart disease, had a transient ischemic attack, and I told my GP when I went in, I only go in about once a year to get antibiotics for my chest, and I told them I suffered from CLAB. And the GP looked very worried, and he said, well, I haven't heard of CLAB, and he turned to his computer to look it up. I said, it's called coughing like a bastard. Everyone in Glasgow has it. It grew up before the Clean Air Act. So my GP now knows there's another disease. So there, I've got 3 or 4 conditions. I had polio at the age of 7, actually, in the great outbreak of that time. So dementia, risk, frailty, they're really all very similar in a way that I'll discuss. So first important point is to understand the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And there are members of the medical profession who are still not clear on this. Dementia is a condition with a loss of functional ability, and Alzheimer's disease is a disease of unknown cause, unpreventable and untreatable at the moment, although there are some promising signs, that is the single major cause of dementia. But we now know there are other causes, and you can reduce your risk of dementia by about 1/3. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about. So let's just get the language straight. I don't like the word pre-dementia or mild cognitive impairment. These are terms you sometimes hear and read about in the press. But I think it's, let's just focus on dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So there are four processes affect us as we live longer. And I talked about these last time in terms of general well-being and living longer, better, being able to drive a car when you're 90, for example, or get upstairs at the age of easily 3 flights of stairs at 78 or whatever. So there are four factors, and these four factors are shown in the diagram, and they interact. And the first one is aging, and aging is a normal biological process. And aging has two effects. It affects your maximum level of ability, your maximum heart rate, for example, and it affects your resilience, your ability to bounce back should something happen. And that something might be a stumble, or it might be a change in temperature, or it might be isolation. And the impact of lockdown is now starting to emerge. So that's aging. Now there's lots of fitness, and fitness is also measured by the maximum level of ability, how quickly you can run or whatever, and also by your resilience. If the fitter you are, the more quickly you'll get back to normal after you've done some exercise. So you see, fitness and aging are very similar. And that's why the medical profession has confused them until very recently. Then thirdly, there's disease. And some disease is caused by aging, and Alzheimer's is one of the diseases in which aging probably plays a part, as in Parkinson's disease. But most disease is caused by our modern environment. I never like the word lifestyle. It implies that you're always to blame for your diseases. But the world in which we live is a world in which we are genetically completely unsuited for. Our genetic package, our genome, has evolved from hundreds of generations, in which is a great advantage to be able to run about all the time. And if you happen to find any calories or steal them from your neighbor, then you put on fat quickly. But for the last two generations, that's completely the wrong package. So high blood pressure, stroke, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, don't think of these as lifestyle diseases. These are environmental diseases. And then there are social factors. Deprivation still affects far too many older people, and ageism affects us all. And there's actually, keep your eyes open tomorrow. There's a very good campaign run by the Centre for Aging Better, and it's having a big launch tomorrow on the fight against ageism and how we all need to think, are we ageist? And that includes us older people too. So those are the four factors. Now let me come down to think a little bit about how these relate to what happens to us if we live longer. And then we'll come on to the ability to reduce your risk. So firstly, normal brain aging does not cause significant problems. In fact, your intellectual abilities, some of them improve with age. Now, aging does affect certain things. It affects short-term memory or long-term memory. And before we came on, I couldn't remember the name of someone called Terry Wogan. Then suddenly I was saying, I've got the face for radio. Terry Wogan first said that. So memory slips. Memory slips are not a sign of dementia. And the other thing is we're not so good at making quick decisions. Now, one of the reasons that people have a negative view of older age groups is that the research done by psychologists, and maybe Harriet can comment on this, she is an academic psychologist, has often used quick decision-making as a test. But actually, quick decision-making isn't all that necessary, except in a pub quiz or if you're landing an airplane. And artificial intelligence will probably do the latter very well in years to come. And the evidence is that we get better at complex decision-making the longer we live. I sometimes say I'm a very experienced public health professional. And then I remind people that Oscar Wilde said his experience is the name we give to our mistakes. So we get better at complex decisions the longer we live. We don't make decisions so quickly. We think of other decisions we've made that have gone wrong, and then we make good decisions. So this is a brief summary of some of the things that happen to us. And as you can see here, the crystallized intelligence that we have, the accumulated knowledge, is very helpful, and it's very helpful in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, secondly, loss of fitness. And there are only two phases in life: a phase of growth and development, and a phase of decline. But for everyone, there's a difference between the best possible rate of decline and the actual rate of decline. And that's called the fitness gap. The turning point, there isn't a stable adult phase of life. The turning point for many people physically is about 22, when they get their first job and buy their first car. But what happens afterwards is not due to aging, but due to the growing fitness gap. The cycling record, for example, the cycling record for men is men can still do 25 miles inside an hour cycling at the age of 80. Women don't perform quite as well as men, partly because they're usually smaller, but I think also because they're usually doing more work at home, whereas the men are out, have more time to go and train. But women in their late 70s are still able to cycle 25 miles in an hour. So there's the fitness gap. And that fitness gap is also mental fitness as well as physical fitness. And the key thing in life is to try to close the fitness gap. And the good news is the fitness gap can be closed at any age by increasing activity. I've called it training there, physical and mental. We can close the fitness gap at any age. Now, the third factor is disease. So remember, as aging is not a cause of major psychological and problems, and by psychology, I mean both the what we call the cognitive, so it's the computer type function of the brain, and the emotional. Loss of fitness is significant. It can affect many people, particularly if they're isolated and deaf. And then we come on to disease. And as you can see here, that there is undoubtedly a disease called Alzheimer's disease. And Professor Alzheimer looked through his microscope over 100 years ago and saw it, the change. Now, as with many diseases like breast cancer or type 1 diabetes or Parkinson's disease, I believe we should always, the medical profession should talk about the plural Parkinson's diseases, because there are quite different types of Parkinson's disease, and there are different types of Alzheimer's disease too. So it's a disease that we cannot prevent or treat at the moment, although there are some promising drugs that are being trialed. And some people with Alzheimer's, they don't have symptoms of dementia. Then there's vascular dementia. That's diseases of the blood vessels. And the disease of the blood vessels cause heart attack, stroke, and dementia. So whenever you see something about preventing heart attack, you should always think that could also reduce my risk of stroke and dementia. Vascular dementia. Remember, the cardiovascular system is the name we give to the heart, and the arteries carrying the oxygen around the body. And vascular dementia is due to disease of the brain. What happens is sometimes if your arteries are damaged, a big part of the brain is blocked, and they may cause paralysis. That's a stroke. But what we've also learned in the last 10 years is that lots of little strokes occur. If you look at the brain scan of someone who's had a lot of these little episodes, it looks like a snowstorm, little white bits of white dotted about the brain. None of them big enough to cause weakness of the arm or leg, like a stroke, but as accumulation they cause dementia. Now, as I say, I don't like the term pre-dementia. I think mild cognitive impairment is a bit of a generalized term, not to be used. So, disease. Remember, disease is caused by the modern environment, not by the modern lifestyle. Then there are social and environmental factors, such as deprivation and loneliness. And when you look at people who are living well in old age, someone said once many years ago, the most important thing is to choose your parents. Choose your parents carefully. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, obviously, if you can choose wealthy parents, that's a good thing. But it may be choosing parents who value education is the most important type of parental choice we have to make. Because it does seem that education is very important. So here you can see two people, one of whom didn't do a great deal of education. They might have left school as soon as they could. The other stayed on and they went to university, did a high degree, were an intellectually demanding job, and then joined the u3a as well. So that person gets higher up in their development before the turning point occurs. So there's the turning point. And then the best possible rate of decline is obviously different for both of those. And remember, there's the fitness gap over there for both of them. But these are social, environmental factors. We'll go back to these. So, what is the evidence that we can prevent or delay dementia? Well, there are two very important bits. One from an organization called NICE, which is the government body, and another from the Lancet, which is one of the top 4 medical journals in the world. So there is strong evidence. And here's the risk reduction strategy. There are 3 main ways of reducing your risk. One is to protect the brain tissue. The second, keep the blood flowing. And the third, keep engaged with a purpose. I'll go through each of these. So firstly, protect the brain tissue. Well, obviously, wearing a helmet if you cycle is one thing, but a lot of brain damage is caused by certain ways in which we live. And I'll just go through these and then we'll think a little bit more about them. Because all of these interact with one another. And although I'm speaking about each of them in a list, then they do interact with each other. So, protect the brain tissue. Firstly, get more active. Physical activity has a direct beneficial effect on the brain. I'm actually a great believer in strength. For when we think of fitness, we often think of stamina, running or swimming. But there are actually 4 aspects of physical fitness, all beginning with S: stamina, suppleness, skill, the ability to recover if you lose your balance. That's why I always brush my teeth standing in one leg, is to keep the brain coordination going, and strength. So any type of physical activity is good for the brain. Also, we need to reduce the impact of stress. Stress causes inflammation, and each of us has our own source of stress. So we can reduce the stress by avoiding the environment that causes the stress, or by learning techniques. And I think, I'm sure you've covered this in your local u3a branches, but yoga, Tai Chi, mindfulness, meditation, these are all good techniques for reducing stress. And what I'm trying to do in the other part of my life is to get the health service to waste less money on drugs that don't do any good and in fact do harm. 25% of all hospital admissions of people over 65 have drug side effects as a significant factor. And be making people aware much more of the benefits of yoga or Tai Chi. These we should be prescribing activity as well as prescribing drugs. Then there's sleeping better, and sleep is very important, and now quite good information about avoid caffeine in the evening, have a pre-sleep ritual, don't nap during the day. But sleep is important for protecting the brain tissue, and then be very cautious about drugs, including medical drugs. So let's just go through these again. Here are some principles of managing stress. And you can see here, exercise is very good, walking is very good, particularly what we call forest bathing, which is a Japanese term. And in Japan, they have little bits of greenery in the middle of cities that people can manage to find a little bit of green space to reduce their stress. And here's this issue of drug side effects. So when we speak about drugs, we tend to think of cocaine and alcohol, but actually medically prescribed drugs are a major issue at the moment, and particularly drugs for depression and anxiety. And what we're seeing now is an awareness of the fact that we may be doing too much medicine. The chief medical officer has written a wonderful report, his annual report, called Aging in a Healthy Society. And he was very clear in there that sometimes there's too much medicine. Now, we shouldn't be denying medicine to people because they're 86 or 78 or whatever other age. That would be ageism. But we do have to recognize that in part because GPs can't prescribe anything else, there's overprescription of medication. So here's just a simple case study about somebody who consumed too much medication. Now, number 2, keep the arteries open and the blood flowing. And that just shows you the massive blood supply that the brain needs. Now, it's very funny. I don't know how many of you have actually seen a brain, not a human brain, but a brain of a sheep or a pig or a cow. On the continent of Europe, you can see brains in the windows of butchers, but here they're all hidden away until they're poured into sausages or whatever. But it's white, the brain. But actually, the amount of blood is similar to the liver and the kidney or muscle, which are red. So there's a huge amount of blood goes through the brain, but it doesn't look it. Now, any reduction or interruption of a big artery causes a stroke or a mini stroke. So there's just some effect on your hand or your arm or whatever. But there are also these strokes, mini strokes, that don't affect your function of moving, so they can't be seen, but they do cause vascular dementia. And here's the simple rules for keeping your arteries flowing. Physical activity, not smoking, weight, and diet. And here are conditions, and these conditions, you see, are all conditions caused by the 21st century's environment, not by lifestyle. It's all too easy to blame people, but I always say if you're commuting from the middle of London to Essex to work and sit 8 hours at a computer screen and then commute back, you don't actually have a lot of time for activity. It's an environmental problem. So, 3, keep engaged, positive, and with a purpose. Now, the advancing issues here are summarized in the scientific literature. And this is an article in something called the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is one of the top 4 journals in the world, along with the Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and what's called the New England Journal of Medicine. And this man, Philip Pitzer, is a very distinguished laboratory scientist. So I saw the title and I thought, oh, that's interesting, as he discovered a chemical that we use for longevity. But look at the subtitle. Purpose, social engagement, and a positive lifestyle. And this was, I say, one of the four top journals. So 2 out of the 4 top journals have made it very clear what we need to do for healthy longevity. So let's just look a bit more at some of these issues here. So learning, well, u3a, you're a dementia prevention service already. Cognitive ability, you're learning new things. Emotional activity, you're meeting with other people to do it. I do sometimes wonder what happens to people who stop going to u3a meetings. I did it in my local library just as an experiment. I stopped going to the library and nothing happened. But the library, the county council, knew I was still alive. So why did I, at the age of 78, stop going to the library? But I'm disappointed to say that no contact has been made with me, saying, oh, are you all right? Could we get a volunteer to take you to the library or bring the books? Or would you like to join a reading group or whatever? So, obviously, there are different things that you can do. Sudoku, crosswords, reading. But I think the sort of work of a u3a, getting in a group and being challenged in something that you haven't thought about before and then discussing it in the group, that's very good dementia prevention. Then there's the issue of being socially engaged. And of course, this becomes very difficult if your mobility is limited. But we now know that digital interaction is not as good as face-to-face, but it is very good. So I'm very interested in digital services for people. And it can be, for example, I said to someone whose mother was in a care home, what's it like? It was always very nice, but she loves Schubert and no one's heard of Schubert in the care home. But I'll bet there's 1,874 people love Schubert in care homes. So that's 1 for every 3.2 care homes. Well, let's get a virtual group going. It doesn't need to be Schubert. It could be Lonnie Donegan or jazz or something else. Let's tackle isolation. Then there's this fascinating issue about purpose. And I think the next talk you've coming up in the series, Janet, sounds as though this is right on the ball. Started to think about what the Japanese call ikigai, keeping working and doing things. Join the u3a, volunteer for your u3a committee, because being a volunteer is very good for you, but being on a committee is even better. And the more difficult the committee, the better it is. And then think of this a mission. So I've been saying to people in residential homes, well, let's adopt the local wildlife trust. Let's raise money. I know you can hardly walk, but every step you take, we could raise money for the local wildlife trust. Keep your hearing and vision sharp, and still deafness is a major problem, which has got much less sympathy than blindness, but the resources are getting better. And there's now a range of hearing services that there weren't before, and hearing loss contribute to dementia. So here's the take-home message. The normal aging process is not a cause of physical problems until the 90s, and dementia is not accelerated normal aging. Secondly, you need to regain fitness, physical, cognitive, and emotional. And thirdly, everything you do to reduce your risk of dementia will reduce your risk of frailty, disability, and dependence. So a common core theme is to think positively. So enough from me, and I'd be very pleased to take comments or feedback. And maybe ask you all, just as an exercise, to think, what message are you going to take away from this? And if you bump into a neighbour, particularly if that neighbour is in their 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, what's the message? What advice can you give them to reduce the risk of dementia?